I'm not quite sure why I got invited back again. There's a couple of different options. Tom knows I'm a glass half full man, and so he wanted someone upbeat for a presentation. So I hope I can deliver, and never let a chance go by. I write a blog on Southeast Asia, the beef industry, and I think one of the other reasons I might have got a start was because I used to be in your position, an industry member here in the Northern Territory, and I always used to have the questions that you have. You know, what's the market doing? Where are we going? What's the future? How do I make decisions? And so when I went to live in Asia, mostly in Indonesia, about 5 or 6 years ago, I started to develop these networks and find out a lot of the answers to the questions that I had. And so I remembered that the people at home were asking the same questions and figured that maybe they'd like to find out. And Ian McBean and Kay, they tell me they read my report, so I know 2 people here read it, and I'm happy that I can provide that information to them because I know they're not in a position to find it out themselves through their own networks. They're busy doing their job here at home. One thing I need to tell you just before we get started is that last month I found Christ. Turns out he's a real estate agent in West Jakarta. If anyone wants to ring him up, there's his number. The other reason why I probably was asked to come back was that I made a rash claim that if the price of beef didn't get up to $4 in a very short time, then I would shout the bar. I don't think I said it exactly that way, but Sean Coots is adamant that that's what it was and that I owe him a beer. Now, I think that because I got within 10 cents or 2.5% of my prediction within 9 months, I don't think that there are too many other analysts, and certainly Mr. Holmes doesn't think so. I got pretty close, and I was 97.5% accurate within a short 9 months. So I reckon that's near enough. Sean doesn't, so I'll be buying him a beer later in a phone box. Okay. I was watching a TV interview with Warren Buffett not long ago, and someone said to him, "Why are you investing in railroads? They've traditionally been a terrible investment." And he said, "Well, US railroads had a really crook century, but now the business case has changed, and I'm happy to invest in them." So it just sort of came to me that the Australian producers have had a really crook 43 years, and I think things have now changed. So the proposition that I'll be trying to put to you today, to prove to you today, or give you some evidence of, is that the Australian cattle producers are now in for a very good century. You'll never be able to get me right or wrong anyway, so we'll all be dead by the time we figure it out. But I actually think this is true. So we're mainly interested in developing markets. That's where the real growth is. And it's just impossible to find out what's going on in these developing markets. The data is poor, we know it's inaccurate, many times it's misleading, there's political interference in statistics, inefficient collection, and usually no collection at all. So in order to develop forecasts of what might be going on in these places, we need to sort of look around the corner, around the back at non-traditional issues and non-traditional factors to help us figure out what might be going on. Now, China is the focus of what I'll be talking about today because they're just the biggest potential consumer in the whole world. So I'll be trying to look outside China at the issues going on outside China to help us get a feel for what might be going on inside China. And it's all back to real basics. It's all about global supply and demand. And you can see from the statistics that came up today, proved it again. Generally, there's static or low supply growth across the whole world. Even Brazil's growth that Adolfo showed us this morning is still pretty slow. It's not going through the roof, it's just a gentle climb. There is a flush of supply from the USA, there is some from Brazil, and there is certainly plenty of supply from India. In terms of demand, there's a moderate growth in demand in China at the moment, and in Southeast Asia a great deal of volatility, but I'll talk about more issues on that in a minute. So I'm presenting a whole range of odd and bits and pieces of the puzzle, and it's not, forgive me if it's not a nice logical sequence of things, because I have to, looking behind the scenes, you've got to pick whatever you can that gives you the information that helps you draw the conclusions that you can't draw because you don't have adequate, accurate information. So just quickly, some bad news, get that out of the way. Significantly weaker slaughter prices in China. SCAS problems and pricing problems in Vietnam. Lots of political intervention in Indonesia, including the introduction of Indian beef that just quickly captured about 50% of our market, and much stronger supplies and weaker prices in the US. The good news is pretty much all about China. That's the way I see it anyway. And there is still quite a bit of good news about Indonesia if we take a big picture and longer term view. China is such an amazing and just astronomically huge place that it's hard to get a perspective. There's so many statistics and so much information. Here's a few points which I hope will give you the perspective that I have about China. So they've got about 100 million cattle and buffalo, so it's a significant herd. They just eat more than that. Their herd is slowly shrinking because smallholders are exiting like it happened in everywhere else in the world. Production slightly increasing because the larger producers are just getting a little bit better at it. Per capita consumption going up slowly. Population increasing because they have finished with the one-child policy. And most important of all, put in red there, wealth is increasing relatively quickly. Retail markets, still about 85% of their meat is sold in the wet markets. And about 5% high-end and some other stuff in the middle. Trust and food safety issues are absolutely huge. Or rather, mistrust is huge because there have been some horrendous scandals with food adulteration. You would remember the melanine in the milk and some terrible things. So outside countries with a high standards and high profile of high food security are particularly favoured. Huge imports of cheap beef, both from India and South America. Live exports have just begun. There's a massive drought going on in Mongolia. So the Mongolian plains used to be, or maybe still is, the large area for grazing. It's their northern territory, and a very big drought there causing quite a lot of animals to come on the market. They've also, the dairy industry in China is oversupplied, and there's quite a bit of culling in the dairy industry. The specific perspective with respect to Australia and China, and this one surprised me when I saw the statistics, is even though we have been the biggest supplier of meat, of beef into China, we still only supply them 3%. That may have shrunk a little bit since the Brazilians have come in, but essentially 3%. It's just insignificant. The majority of that product is frozen with no strong quality profile. It's everything from offals and bits and pieces to some high-end product. Australia is the only legal supplier of fresh beef into China. Except for the start of this week, New Zealand got permission for a trial, and they'll probably get a Guernsey there too. Also, Australia is the only legal importer of live cattle for feeding and fattening. So we have a very special, privileged position in the Chinese market. Now, getting closer to the nitty-gritty. So, 100 million cattle in China, 60 million beef cattle, 20 million buffaloes, 20 million dairy cows. The statistics are always a bit tricky, but the number 5.8 kilograms per person per year is generally accepted. By 1.3 something billion people gives you a consumption of about 7.6 million tonnes, or 6 cattle a tonne. 45 million head need to be killed every year. So clearly they can't kill 45 million out of 100 million and have many left next year. So the official Chinese production statistics say that they produce about 5 million tonnes in their country from their own resources, which relates to around about 30 million cattle, so those numbers sound sort of within reason. In 2015, the legal imports were 600,000 tonnes. So there was 5 million tonnes produced locally and 600,000 tonnes brought in legally. 7.6 million tonnes were consumed, so where did the other 2 million tonnes come from? The elephant in the room is an Indian elephant. Now, this is what's called the grey route, or all sorts of other, the unofficial this and that, but whatever it is, it's product that comes in the back door, unofficially, about 1 million tonnes. Another port of entry, there's only 7 million people live in Hong Kong, but they eat nearly as much as 1.3 billion on the mainland. So the statistics say, but of course most of that meat goes across that bit of water there into China. And then there's a lot of live cattle moving around Southeast Asia that end up across the border into China. And they get there through a multiple of different ways. These blokes are pretty good whilst they're going, but it's not real good when they come to a corner or they need to stop in a hurry. This is, Tom started with his sayings. I'll come up with an old Chinese saying. The mountains are high and the emperor is far away. So this is a particularly good map of a Google map. Anyway, this is over on the left side is the eastern side of India. Thank you. Where is it? Yeah, okay. All right. India over here. Sorry. This is the Himalayan mountains, and the Himalayas come down into China here in the western Hunan province. This is Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and China here. So this is a very far away, this place is very far away from the main activity, the main business centres of China. So the Chinese changed from being a net exporter to a net importer about 2009-10. And miraculously, the Indian beef exports to Asia went up from about a little bit more than 200,000 tonnes to a little bit more than 1.2 million tonnes at about the same time. So I can't be accused of specifically claiming that this comes from Indian beef, but it just seems to be a reasonable assumption from my personal perspective. During that time, Vietnam is the biggest importer of Indian beef in the world. 2014, 900,000 tonnes, 800 last year. Vietnamese don't like Indian beef. they don't like buffalo beef. They don't like frozen product. They like Australian and their own local fresh meat. So a lot of this product doesn't actually end up in Vietnam. This is one of the border crossings between Vietnam and China. And you can imagine the trade between Vietnam and China is astronomical. And in order to get the millions and millions of tons of product across the border, there are lots of these type of crossings, and it's a massive undertaking. And a very large quantity of product gets across the other side of the border, and nobody knows where it went. As well as the front gate border crossings, there are the back gate border crossings. The Vietnamese are the most flexible and don't take no for an answer group. Ask the US Army. They found out the hard way. They don't like being told what to do, and if they need to do something, they will do it. On the Mekong, these freighters can go up in shallow water, and the Mekong is a fabulous trade route that can go from Southeast Asia straight into China. The OIE is the United Nations International Animal Health Agency. In 2015, they did a survey, mainly a survey of the movements of live animals along the Southeast Asian borders and the Chinese border. And their aim was to figure out what might be the implications for foot and mouth disease transmission. And their very conservative estimates were that about 1 million head of live cattle go across, starting from India rather, all the way to Vietnam. And this is another graph of their graphs with lines going everywhere, but animals moving in vast numbers from Southeast Asia and India into China. Some of these cattle go on these small boats up the river. I think this is the only double-decker in Southeast Asia. It takes cattle from around the Bangkok area, where the people who own this truck have a large feedlot. Their abattoir is only about 15 kilometres away, so they don't use this to go to the abattoir. This takes animals up to the northern borders, and I'm only assuming that what happens to them when they get there. But it's the most efficient transport in the country. And then there's a Vietnamese foot falcon. They call it the green border. So where there's no road or no gate, and the animals are walked across an imaginary border, it's called the green border. This is from the OIE report. The OIE also put in this slide, which shows how animals are moved out of the Assam province in northeast India, and they come down. This is a tremendous mountain range here causing the boundary between India and Burma. And they come down this, probably a bit of a goat track, and down onto some bitumen roads here to the border. And there's a little town on the border called Muse. And then when you cross the border into China, this is the road they find on the other side. One of the most spectacular roads you'll ever want to see. And it's in the middle of nowhere. Kunming, this road goes from the border, Burmese border, to Kunming. Kunming is sort of like Darwin. It's an out-of-the-way, third-tier city, only 7 million people. In the scheme of things, China's pretty small, so it's a bit like Darwin. And Muse is a bit more like Rabbit Flat. It definitely is nowhere. So this road goes from Darwin to Rabbit Flat. So, and it's built by the Chinese at goodness knows how much. So they're assuming that there's going to be a lot of stuff going on this road, and some of it's probably going to be cows, maybe some of it's frozen meat. After Kunming, it goes the same road, but not just designed for this little bit of traffic. goes all the way to the east coast in a similar format. And it ends up in a place called Hangzhou, which is it's a first-tier city just to the south of Shanghai. And believe it or not, there's also a fast railway line going to Rabbit Flat. So this hasn't been built for tourists. This has been built to take lots of freight. Sometimes along this border, or this very long border of all of these nations, there's a bit of dispute. And only a few weeks ago, there was some Mews was the subject of some air raids and all sorts of stuff because of some civil war type issues in Burma. So they're probably not using that crossing point at the moment. So there's these massive irresistible forces. There's 1 billion people on one side of the border, short of beef, and goodness knows what else. On the other side of the border, there are the products, the live animals and the frozen product. There's thousands of kilometres of different geographical opportunities to move those products across, and there's endless flexibility to overcome whatever obstacles might get in the way. Not to mention a fabulous win-win for the parties on both sides of the fence. The only people that miss out are the governments who don't get any tariffs. Then what happens is governments legalise movements of product which were previously illegal, and so China has recently allowed in Brazil, and probably is not far off from letting the US back in, maybe Canada and probably others. But the way I see it, this really doesn't represent new competition. This is simply product coming down here instead of coming down there. So it's the same product, or close to the same product. So it's simply being rerouted the legal way instead of being brought in the illegal way. So I don't see it as new competition coming out of Brazil, or if the US comes in. The US is coming in through Hong Kong now. Brazil's been coming in through Hong Kong. Now it probably goes straight into the main ports of China. So additional demand, real additional demand, new demand from China will need to be filled by new production from Brazil, from Australia, from the US, from wherever else it needs to, from India, wherever else it comes from. The internet's full of these graphics on China. This is the one that struck me the most. So it relates to, it's from the Economist Intelligence Unit, reasonably reputable outfit. So the spending power of the Chinese population in 2015 compared to 2030. Now that we're 17, we're only 13 years away from this second one. Now, most of the focus so far has been on the expanding middle class. But looking at, and they're very important and they're a huge market, but I think the more interesting market is the really rich people. So here the really rich people only represent 3%. And when I'm talking about rich, this is 40,000 US a year. This is the same similar rate to the Australian population. So in 2030, they're talking about 15%, or 200 million, another 160 odd million people rich enough to buy the same meat as you and me. So I think that's going to translate into a huge amount of new business. And this is not business that's already supplied by someone else. This has to come from new cows, new land. If you do a very crude sum back of the envelope, 200 million suddenly rich Chinese, eat 10 Ks, 2 million tonnes, 6 head to the tonne, you need another 12 million slaughter cattle to fill that gap. Or about 36 million breeders out there somewhere producing this. Now, Brazil's probably the only place on earth that has a scope to expand out 36 million. Thanks very much. Let's just go over there. But even Brazil would not do that in a hurry. So in 13 years' time, when these people say, well, we're ready, there's going to be a big lag phase. If at all, it can be addressed. And just one more, my fantastic statistics coming out of China. 122 million people left China for citizens left China for an overseas holiday last year. If you can afford an overseas holiday, you can afford some good beef and lots of other good things. So they're coming. Look out. My agent took this picture in a supermarket in Beijing, and it's some Brazilian beef, and it's largely low quality product, and it's selling at very discounted prices. Now, the immediate question that comes to my mind is, why would Australia want to be competing with a very cheap product out of Brazil when it could be competing with the likes of this Calara product from Australia? Now, I'm familiar with it. This is their Chinese advertising, but I buy this product in Jakarta, and it's the most fabulous meat you'll ever want to eat. And so why would you be wanting to, $40 a kilo, why would you be wanting to pay 10 or 15 or $20 a kilo for really, really low quality rough stuff when you can dine on the best? So why would you want to market and compete with the low quality stuff from all the other low cost competitors around the world when you can eat the best and sell the best? Okay, I'll just give them a rest for a minute. Back to Indonesia. There are lots of positives about Indonesia, even though there's enough bad news there too. There's a clear segment in the market. As Andrew showed you before, the consumers clearly recognise what they're buying. It'd be a bit easier for them if it was marked, but from what I see, they can determine what's fresh and what's frozen, and they know. They don't like, the mums and dads don't like buying frozen meat, full stop. They like fresh meat, but the manufacturing and the food service are very happy to buy low-cost Indian product. So it's taken over a very large chunk of the market. There is still strong demand for fresh product, and at about the same price. There is, despite all the issues in Indonesia, their economic growth, their GDP growth continues about 5%, pretty strong. Population growth still going well. Their herd, as you saw from Andrew's graph, their herd is under great pressure. But they have also, maybe as a result, opened East Java for feeder trade. There's the mandatory heifer purchase, and there is the bilateral project of the Red Meat Partnership. There is one particular project run by Dick Slaney in Jakarta, demonstrating the performance of Australian breeders under a range of the conditions in Indonesia, and his group is doing a mighty job, and I reckon it will lead to a significant opportunities for Australian breeders in Indonesia. Just one of the positives, so at the moment, Australian live cattle are only able to be exported into West Java, over here, or Sumatra. Only last 2 months ago, East Java, traditionally the sort of breeding and cattle centre of Java, opened the market after a 10-year closure. Now, I can only assume that they opened it only because they're short of breeders and they're short of feeders, and so the feeder trade is going in there. There are 39 million people live in East Java, so there is scope for additional product to go in there. Even if we've lost 50% of the market, we could recapture another a different 50% if we end up with access to East and potentially Central Java. The breeder, the 5-in-1 breeder story, we don't really know how, that's really not developing yet. The people have brought in their feeders and they have this obligation of breeders, and nothing much has happened as yet. There's potential for it to go to smallholders or also plantations. Qurban, the religious festival of slaughter, is another elephant in the room. I'll come to that in a minute. So lot feeders, all right, let me get going. They're running out of cattle in Java. This is a feedlot I went to in Central Java, and they're all happy to tell you they find it very difficult to get new stock. Korban kills about 300,000 head minimum of bulls on one day. The 4 weeks from Ramadan to Lebaran, they probably kill another 500,000 head, mostly bulls. So for the rest of the year, pretty much all that's left is the breeder herd, and they get killed. So that's the reason why that graph of Andrew's was going downhill. Vietnam is not so much good news in Vietnam. They are very price sensitive, not to mention they're not really excited about SCAS. But just for the price sensitivity, this is a calculation I did with an Australian salary of $42,000 made equivalent to Vietnam $5,000. That's your daily income. This is how much a kilogram of beef costs in each place. So when an Australian buys a kilogram of beef, it costs him 8% of his daily wages. When a Vietnamese buys 1 kilogram of beef, it costs him 97% of his daily wages. So when you put the price up, he's not happy, and he is resistant to the price rise. He also has a massive pig herd and pretty good quality pork to select from. Now, just a quick rundown on the competition. Central and South America primarily. There's a lot of great cattle over there, but it's a very, very long way to sail across the Pacific here, and by and large, the freight is so expensive, it just doesn't add up. Last year, I was lucky enough to go to Colombia. It's foot and mouth free with vaccination, and they're already negotiating with Vietnam to take cattle in there. About $2 a kilo farm gate, beautiful cattle, but right now it still doesn't add up. I also got to Mexico last year, and 16 million head of cattle, foot and mouth free, because it's part of the US North American free trade area. Northern Bos taurus cattle in the north, Bos indicus cattle in the south. Some massive processing there. This Sukarne is a very big company. They claim to be the biggest. This is the biggest meat processing plant in the world, with a capacity of 300,000 cattle fed every day, and only 600 kilometres from the Texas border, and 0 tariffs, and a 4-lane highway. But they've got our friend here, Mr. Trump, who might just put all sorts of spanners in the works, but who would guess? Who would know? You've heard about Brazil, lots of cattle, slightly more expensive, also a very long way. So for live cattle, not really a competition, and still some areas that aren't free of disease. Southern Africa is also a potential supplier. Foot and mouth disease free largely in South Africa. Even Lesotho and Swaziland are free. The only area that's not officially free is the Kruger National Park. And you can also see here Botswana and Namibia free without vaccination. So a very high status, and except for their wilderness areas and some good ports, but no not much of a chance of competition. Their prices are reasonably high and the freight is huge. Very quickly on beef, let me pass up. My last frequent flyer points were earned going to India last year in December, and that's a fascinating spot. So 115 million dairy buffalo, astronomical. So the dairy buffalo, the meat from the Indian beef is a byproduct of the dairy industry. Cull cows, draft bulls, young males. Buffalo beef production roughly 4.2 something million tonnes. If we use a carcass about 20 million odd buffaloes killed. Exports about 2 million tonnes, and the rest of it's eaten inside the country. There's 180 million Muslims in India and 30 million Christians. So there's over 200 million meat eaters to help chew away on the balance of the buffalo. The biggest threat that I see in the region is this one, and China's current legal maritime boundary is up here. But their current claim is all of this. So they have claimed, I'm not sure how they go about that, and chased off the other people. They've claimed all of that sea area from other Southeast Asian nations, and you've seen a bit on the TV. So they've also claimed that they're not ramping up their military strength, but I'm not sure whether they're bluffing or telling fibs or what. So, in summary, it's all back to basic supply and demand. By and large, the world's supply is static, and the world's demand, dominated by Asia, is growing. And I think, and everyone else thinks, it's going to grow an awful lot more. Almost certainly far faster than anyone else can keep up. And that will need new demand. It's not product that's out there in the fridge waiting to go somewhere. This is new product which will be required. So, and then I think the prospects for the world's most efficient beef industry, that is Australia, is the best they've been for 40 years. And we're currently in an world economic slump. So I think it's a pretty safe bet that the Australian industry is looking forward to a very good century. Thank you.